Hello and welcome to State of the Economy. Today we have as our guest Dr. R K Pachauri, Director General of TERI, as well as Chairman of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. But our conversation today will strictly pertain to his role in the recently released synthesis report of the IPCC, which lends an urgency to various climate change initiatives which countries have been talking about all these years. Welcome to our show, Dr. Pachauri.
Thank you.
Now, you're chairman of the IPCC, which came up with the synthesis report a fortnight ago, which based on both research as well as experience of the last decade and a half, has said that countries now cannot wait any longer. They have to cut emissions by up to 70% by 2030 or 2050. Now, given this urgency, how do you think India should respond, considering that India has so many poor, 600 million poor, and it has both responsibility as well as opportunity to participate in this in evolving a carbon-free world going forward?
Well, firstly, thank you for this opportunity. Let me say that the synthesis report is the synthesis essentially of 3 working group reports, which represent something like 5,000 pages of published material. Yeah. And what we have over here is the summary for policymakers of the synthesis report, everything contained in 40 pages. Yeah. Now, what we have come up with as a set of findings clearly shows, firstly, that human actions are really affecting the climate of this planet. And we have said that most of the warming that has taken place since the middle of the last century is extremely likely the result of human actions. And when we say extremely likely, we're associating a probability of 95% plus.
So now, post-industrialization you're talking about, right?
Absolutely. And since the middle of the last century, we have been the overwhelming reason for changes in climate. And in fact, it's sad that despite UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which came into existence in 1992, the rate of emissions has actually gone up recently. Just to give you a number,
so you're suggesting that all the commitments made under Kyoto Protocol and subsequently by nations voluntarily are not really being observed in spirit?
They have been largely ineffective, because if you look at the rate of growth of emissions prior to the year 2000, it was roughly 1.3% per annum. And in this period, it's been 2.2% per annum.
Okay. What is this period? The
2000 to 2010.
2010, okay.
So the world...
So it's worsening, the situation is worsening.
Absolutely. And therefore, what we really need is to take into account the impacts of climate change, which are becoming progressively more serious. And if we continue on a business as usual path without additional mitigation, then we are going to reach a level where, for instance, sea level rise by the end of this century could be as high as 0.98 meters. That means a meter, essentially. And that clearly makes it very difficult for the small island states, low-lying coastal communities to be able to survive.
So the more vulnerable populations will be affected first.
Absolutely.
If you don't take action.
But that's not all. There's also an increase in extreme events, extreme precipitation events, heavy rainfall in a short period of time or heavy snowfall in a short period of time, and heat waves, both in terms of frequency and intensity. So I think the world has to accept that the impacts of climate change, once they go beyond a certain point, we would not be able to cope with them. We need to start adapting to the impacts of climate change, because there's a certain inertia in the system, as a result of which, even if we bring emissions down to 0 today, impacts will continue for a while. But what is critically important is for us to mitigate emissions of greenhouse gases.
And what are the mitigation measures that you are suggesting from the latest report?
A whole range of things. For instance, we have to improve energy efficiency. We have to move to low carbon sources of energy.
Move away from fossil fuel for sure?
Yes. For instance, by the middle of this century, we will have to treble or quadruple the supply of energy from zero or low carbon sources like renewables, possibly nuclear, and bioenergy with carbon capture and storage.
Solar energy.
Solar, of course, renewable energy could be
Part of
solar,
that, yeah.
wind, biomass, a whole range of these technologies. And all of this can only be achieved if we start today. Because if you want to treble or quadruple the supply of energy from these low carbon sources, then obviously it's not going to happen overnight.
Here, I want to ask you a question. Now, since energy is the biggest source of greenhouse gas emissions, right?
Right.
So, energy is the most critical component of mitigation, am I right? Mitigation efforts?
Also deforestation.
Yeah.
We have to stop deforestation.
So, in the context of energy,
Yes.
China and India will have to necessarily move away from coal-based power to non-fossil fuel. Is that a given?
Well, this is a global imperative.
It's a global imperative.
Yeah, the only way we can continue using coal is if we can develop carbon capture and storage technologies. Okay. Now, that's something which it seems by the end of the century we'll have to put in place in a big way. But, you know, at the moment that technology is far away. And in fact, the IPCC brought out a special report on it about 10 years ago. And therefore, I think for us, a country like India, to my mind, renewable energy makes enormous sense. We also have to improve energy efficiency. Now, that means we have to bring about some structural shifts.
Per unit of GDP, as it is. Yeah.
Right. We have to bring about structural shifts in, let's say, the transport sector, which is becoming more and more carbon intensive, more and more dependent on imports. And we also have to start constructing buildings that are far more efficient in the use of energy. And that's something where, if I can wear my other hat as Director General of TERI, we have demonstrated that there are means, there are technologies by which you can design and construct buildings that are much more energy efficient.
And coming back to the synthesis report,
right.
Cutting emissions up to 70%. Isn't that the target for
2050?
2050.
40 to 70% reduction.
Yeah,
over the 2010
over the 2010
baseline.
base, right?
Right.
So you feel that this is achievable if we follow the strategy that you're talking about?
It is achievable provided we take it seriously and start moving quickly.
Because now, where will the investments? One contentious issue which has constantly cropped up in various multilateral fora, UNFCCC, even among countries when they meet, is who will pay for these technologies, bulk of the poor, can they afford, as we, in the transition period at least, especially in solar power and other non-fossil fuel power, they'll cost more in the initial phase. Now, somebody has to bear the cost. Now, do you think there is any consensus evolving in regard to that? Because the OECD countries have promised $100 billion of corpus by 2020. Now, is that forthcoming?
It's not. But may I say that as far as renewable energy is concerned, in a number of niche areas, it is already economically viable.
Okay.
Yeah. If you look at solar lighting, for instance, and I can say this on the basis of experience that we've had in 3,000 villages, it is far more attractive to use photovoltaic technology for lighting in rural homes that are far away from the grid than to use kerosene.
So you're saying that the technology on its own will improve to a point where you won't need such magnitude of funding?
Yes, there are some countries that would need it because there are much poorer countries than India and countries which have no technological base or expertise. I think there we would need large-scale assistance. But I'd like to submit that as far as India is concerned, there is no reason why we really cannot become leaders in some of these technologies. Yes, we would need assistance, no doubt. But
do you think this Make in India strategy of Narendra Modi can help bring global companies who are at the cutting edge of developing solar technology to really come here and set up projects here?
Absolutely. I think if we make in India, we should make sure that, as the Prime Minister said, that we should not only make in India, but also make sure that we don't ruin the environment. Yeah. And therefore, we should attract industries that are going to be clean, that are also going to generate a large number of jobs. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the benefits I'd like to submit from some of these options. There are huge co-benefits. You see, if you mitigate emissions of greenhouse gases, you're improving the security of energy supply. You're also improving the local environment. If you look at, for instance, lighting using kerosene, that's extremely harmful for the human health. So there are co-benefits in terms of health benefits.
And moving away from fossil fuel will also save us precious foreign exchange.
Exactly.
And you were giving me some data on how much imports will we have if we continue depending on fossil fuels.
You know, if we move on a business as usual path, you'd be amazed at how much fossil fuel energy we would be importing in the year 2031-32. 900 million tons of coal, almost 700 million tons of oil. Can this country afford it? And do we have the places where you might be able to get so much coal, for instance? And if you were to get it, what about the port capacity? What about the internal transportation that would be required?
Yeah, plus also I mean, geopolitical blackmail, you know, when you depend on energy sources from all over the world, people can hold you to ransom. So
the world has suffered from that in the past.
So moving away to say solar or non-fossil fuel will reduce dependence on other countries which may be potentially in a position to blackmail you, right?
Yeah, you know, we don't have to pay Surya Devta for the sunshine that we get. And of the G20 countries, let me say, India gets the largest abundance of solar energy of the whole lot.
Sure.
So we really need to go aggressively after
Which is why it's a bit of an irony that Germany produces more solar energy today than India does. Is that true?
Yeah, that's absolutely right.
Germany doesn't have probably 10% of solar resources India has, right?
Tata BP Solar was exporting the bulk of its photovoltaic production to Germany for a number of years.
We'll, Dr. Pachauri, take a small break here and come back to the discussion. Please don't go away and keep watching RSTV. Welcome back to State of the Economy. We are having a conversation with Dr. R K Pachauri, DG of the TERI as well as Chairman of IPCC. Dr. Pachauri, you were talking about the need to move to non-fossil fuel for India, and we need to do it as of yesterday. We can't waste any more time, right? Now, I want to ask you something about the politics that is going on among countries in the context of IPCC's assessment and in the context of mitigation measures that multilateral agencies like UNFCCC are suggesting that these countries take. Now, China recently did a bilateral climate change deal with the US, where they made certain commitments, and the outcome is, numbers show that China and the US, the remaining carbon space that the world has today, which is about 250 billion tons roughly, would be virtually used up by US and China as per that agreement, and that's what experts say. Now, where does that leave all other developing countries, especially the island states? If US and China were to do such a bilateral deal, now where does that, how does that square with the multilateral effort that is going on? I'm at a loss to understand that.
Well, you know, for the first time, the IPCC has been able to come out with what we call a carbon budget. Yeah. If we want to maintain temperature increase below 2 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. Yeah. And you're absolutely right. Of the 800 odd gigatons of carbon space that we have available for this particular temperature target, we have used up 515 or so. Yeah. So what we're left with is very, very small. And this is something that I think in the multilateral discussions and negotiations has to be highlighted. If that space is going to be occupied by a certain group of countries, where does it leave some of the poorest nations in the world? Because some of them may not have the ability to develop without increasing their emissions. And you know, this is something that is
so what
very,
could be
very
the intention, say on US's part, to do such an agreement with China? Now, President Obama is coming to India to as a chief guest of a Republic Day. Strategic experts are saying that Obama is now building a new kind of relationship with India. Now, India might also go for a bilateral deal with US. Now, where would India's potential bilateral deal stand vis-a-vis China's bilateral deal with the US on climate change?
Well, if I had to suggest anything, I would say that if India gets into a bilateral deal, it should be on the development of clean energy sources. because that would be of benefit to us. It would be of benefit to the global community. And I think this is something where the two countries can collaborate and work together and accelerate the pace at which some of these new technologies can be developed.
So special partnership among private sector, within private sector,
Including
Indian
government.
and US private sector?
Yes, as well as research organizations,
Okay.
and of course with government support on both sides, because I think it's really a win-win opportunity, and it has just so many
So you say that
benefits.
could be our answer to the US-China
Exactly.
bilateral deal?
Exactly. Because clearly, I mean, to get into the business of when you're going to peak and when you're not going to peak is something that's not going to be settled in any bilateral discussion. But this is something which is a win-win opportunity. Both sides benefit from it.
Do you think that the US, by doing that deal with China, which numbers show would enable China to occupy the bulk of the future space, carbon space, US is also trying to provoke India into coming into a deal with it, also telling us that that you also should wake up and smell the coffee?
Well, I wouldn't know about that. I personally would welcome the fact that China and the US have agreed on this deal, because it clearly shows that the two largest economies in the world have committed themselves to some targets for reducing emissions.
Even if those
of
targets
greenhouse
are
gases.
unfair to the rest of the world.
And I still regard that as work in progress, because, you know, after all, they've decided on this today. They wouldn't have done this 5 years ago. And who knows, 5 years down the road, they may realize, my God, this is not enough. Let's do more. So I would say this is just the start of a journey. That's the way I look at it.
So you'd rather look at the glass as half full
Absolutely.
in regard to US-China?
Yes, it's a beginning.
Yeah.
And I think it's a beginning that, in my view, should perhaps be welcomed. But this is a necessary but not a sufficient
Not
action.
sufficient.
Yeah.
And how should India look at it? I must, in this context, tell you, Mr. Suresh Prabhu was Sherpa for the G20, Prime Minister Modi's Sherpa. He made a statement 4 weeks ago that India must dehyphenate from China because our priorities, our strategies could be different in the coming 10 years, a decade or so. He said that because probably he felt that China was already, China's GDP had grown, 5 times ours. So they are at a different level of economic development. So we need to take care of our interests, right? So, so how do you, now China has dehyphenated itself from India and moving on to the developed countries camp, as it were, by doing this bilateral deal with the US. So how should we respond?
Well, I think as far as we are concerned, we are not in the same league as China.
Yeah.
I mean, their
First, we
emissions
need
are...
to recognize that we are not in the same league.
Yeah, their emissions are 4 times per capita as ours. So therefore, I don't think you can hyphenate the two at all. It should never have been done.
So you're saying that this whole strategy of being part of basic grouping Brazil, India, China in the context of climate change might have been a mistake earlier.
Well, I question why it was done and what the benefits were.
So have you been questioning this before also?
Yes, I have, as a matter of fact. And but anyway, I'm not involved in the negotiations, so I really wouldn't be able to say anything of substance on that subject.
No, purely as an analyst, as a leading analyst of environment.
I've never seen any benefit of, a grouping of four, because, this is a framework convention on climate change which involves all the countries of the world. And of course, there is the issue of common but differentiated responsibility. I'm not too sure whether there was any great benefit in our being part of this small grouping. But the point I'd like to make is that, we also have to define the kind of development that we want. You go to the streets of Mumbai or Delhi, and what is even worse, Beijing, traffic hardly moves. And how many people can afford the kind of transportation that all of us are promoting? We have to go in for a very different modal mix of transport in this country.
I think Prime Minister Narendra Modi has spoken about this in some fora, that we have to evolve our own pattern of consumption.
Absolutely.
I mean, what could it be? I mean,
well, he's also emphasized the fact.
Even Manmohan Singh used to say that India cannot consume the way the West had done in the last 100 years. So, but then nobody's really sort of suggesting an alternative path, as it were.
You see, my big grouse is that in this country, we have never really got down to a definition of what constitutes development. Why do we have to assume that development is precisely what has been achieved in North America or some other part of the world? We have to develop our own ethos, our own direction in terms of what development means. And what we are doing, for instance, with several of our sort of blind copying of the West, is something that would really not be of benefit to the common man in this country. And since you raised the comparison with China, I mean, China is urbanizing far more rapidly than we can ever afford to do. We still have a very large rural population, and they would be best served by decentralized, distributed forms of power generation using renewable sources of energy.
It's an opportunity for us.
It's a remarkable opportunity.
The fact that 500 million people
Yes.
still don't have access to traditional sources of energy, electricity. So it's an opportunity for us to have a completely decentralized distribution of power, maybe solar power.
Yeah, and I can assure you, and I can give you data on all the
So
work
therefore,
that
our
we've done.
urbanization path could also be different from that of China.
Absolutely. Because, they have done it for whatever reasons. We need to ask ourselves, and after all, don't forget Gandhiji. He always said, India lives in the villages. Why have we lost sight of that reality? Those villages tomorrow will become townships, no doubt. But let's first start seeing that the villages and their needs are met in a way that's decent and respectable. We are not doing that.
So you're saying that it's still not late. We even today we can sit and deconstruct the traditional notion of development and reconstruct our own path,
Absolutely.
trajectory of development. Right?
Absolutely. And what I'd like to emphasize is that going on a low carbon path of development has so many co-benefits for us that those give us an overwhelming reason for adopting a totally different path of development. And therefore, like you said, make in India, the Prime Minister is emphasizing that. We have to ensure that whatever we make in India is consistent with this particular objective of very low or no impacts on the environment, and also ensuring that we are not mortgaging our future by becoming dependent on fossil fuel energy, which we are going to import for a long, long time to come in larger quantities.
But for this to happen, Dr. Pachauri, we need a kind of a bigger intellectual and ideological, as it were, buy-in from industry.
Absolutely.
Today, if you talk about moving away from the current mode of urbanization, traffic, vehicles on the road, SUVs, the auto industry should also come on board. We can't
They must. And after a certain stage, they will not allow changes to happen. They'll become so powerful. I mean, this is what has happened in several other societies in the world, that some of these industries become gigantic in size, and then they exert political power and influence over public opinion that becomes very difficult to counter.
Essentially, you're suggesting that there is still a chance for India to not only evolve a development trajectory which is different from the West, also which is different from China, the way China is going at the moment, right?
Absolutely.
And we need not necessarily go from per capita carbon emission of what China might achieve by 2030, 12, 13 tons. So we could limit our per capita much lower by our own efforts.
Yes, and because our endowment of energy in this country is very different from that of.
So that could be India's brand proposition before the rest of the world.
The rest of the world. We can be examples to the rest of the world. And I'm not saying that we do it at the cost of some sacrifice that we carry out. We shouldn't. But we should really be innovative in coming up with a path of development that gives us the gains of development without necessarily becoming dependent on a huge increase in imports of fossil fuels, coal and oil.
Thank you, Dr. Pachauri, for talking to us. That's all we have in this edition of State of the Economy. We'll be back with you next week. Thanks for watching.